Fellas, everyone likes to talk about who the greatest of all time is in the UFC, who the greatest in every single weight class is, you know, who the greatest of all time is, but no one ever talks about who the second greatest of all time is. Who is the runner-up to the GOAT? Who would have been the greatest of all time had the actual GOATs not existed? So we're going to be going through every weight class from heavyweight to flyweight and picking out who the second greatest of all time is, because everyone does the same thing when it comes to the GOATs. Everyone has their own GOAT list, but I'm going to be choosing who is just in second place, just behind the actual GOAT for the greatest of all time, because nobody ever talks about him. I think it'll be interesting to see who is just about behind the actual greatest of all time. So we're going to be going through every weight class. Let me know your thoughts, and we'll start off in the heavyweight division. For the heavyweight division, for the second greatest of all time, I've chosen Fedor Emelianenko, obviously behind Stipe Miocic. Yeah, Fedor in his prime was an absolute monster. It was like a grizzly bear fighting human beings. You got to put it to put it into perspective. This guy was fighting in pride against the best heavyweights in the world. All of them were on juice, and there was no rules, and Fedor Emelianenko was dominating those guys. He absolutely dominated Pride, and what he did in Pride and what he did to those opponents was absolutely incredible. He has a 10-year unbeaten streak as well. This guy in Pride and in his prime was on an absolute roll. Some people would go as far to say that Fedor in his prime would beat any heavyweight to ever exist on any given day. This guy was that good, and he pretty much looked unbeatable in his prime. Obviously, he might have had a bit of a stubbly career when he joined, Strike Force, but in Pride and in his absolute prime, I keep saying Pride and prime and they sound the same, but in his prime, this guy was just dominating everyone who put in front of him. So we've got to acknowledge Fedor Emelianenko. I would say that he's the greatest MMA fighter to never join the UFC. Even though he never joined the UFC and had a career there, which could have potentially put him at number one, we've still got to acknowledge what he did. He had some great wins in Bellator, Strike Force, Pride, and overall, in my opinion, definitely top two greatest heavyweights of all time with Stipe Miocic. Some people would put him at number one, and to be honest, I'm not even going to argue with that, because like I said, this guy was absolutely insane. He was like the pioneer for MMA heavyweight. So Fedor Emelianenko, I'm going to have to put him as the second greatest heavyweight of all time. I'm going to have to put Stipe at number one just because of what he did in the UFC, but Fedor Emelianenko for me 100% has to make the list, and he's 100% the greatest heavyweight, and it's actually quite close between him and Stipe. It's not like Stipe's miles ahead of him. They are quite close as well, but I'm going to put Fedor in heavyweight. Then we've got Daniel Cormier in the light heavyweight division. This guy absolutely dominated the light heavyweight division, and the only guy he couldn't actually beat was Mr. John Jones himself, who most would regard as the greatest of all time and definitely the greatest light heavyweight of all time. His only loss at light heavyweight, like I said, was to John Jones. Well, obviously the second fight was a no contest because Jones got popped for steroids, but Daniel Cormier in his light heavyweight career, he had such a good resume. Alexander Gustafsson, who was incredible at the time, Anthony Rumble Johnson twice, Volkan Oezdemir. He had the fight with Anderson Silva on short notice, which, he was able to beat Silva as well. Dan Henderson, just everyone that this guy was beating, Roy Nelson, everyone that this guy was beating, he was just dominating everyone. His wrestling, some of the best wrestling in the UFC, and he made it look so effortless as well. Daniel Cormier, just effortless, his wrestling was so good to the point where he was just picking people up, slamming and ragdolling them, making them look like absolute amateurs, and this guy definitely achieved a lot. 4 title defenses in total, and that's only talking about light heavyweight, not even what he did in heavyweight, and he just dominated his era. Like I said, if John Jones didn't exist, and if John Jones obviously didn't get popped for steroids, there's an argument to make that Daniel Cormier could have been the greatest light heavyweight of all time had Jones not existed, but he did. So we're going to put DC at number 2, definitely one of the best, and just because Jones might be the number 1 at light heavyweight, we can't really forget what DC has done. And like I said, it's not even just what he did at light heavyweight, it's what he did at heavyweight as well. So I'm going to put DC at number 2 in light heavyweight, and then middleweight, love him or hate him, it's Israel Adesanya. Obviously, Anderson Silva's number 1, and he's going to be staying that for what seems like it's going to be a while, but Israel Adesanya definitely has to go number 2. 6 title defenses. This guy absolutely dominated middleweight in his prime, and I understand the competition might have not been the best competition. It might have not been the same competition that Anderson Silva was facing, but he was able to beat every middleweight that he was handed to him. He had some good wins as well. Robert Whittaker, Yoel Romero, the Kelvin Gastelum fight was an absolute banger. There were a few fights in there that weren't the best. The Marvin Vettori fights were kind of just fights that you want to skip over, but same for the Jared Cannonier fight. But a lot of the time, Adesanya was just dominating the middleweight division. He had some great wins, and he's only lost twice in middleweight history, obviously to Alex Pereira and Sean Strickland, and one of those guys in Pereira he's able to get a win over, and he's actually won one against Pereira, and that's in the UFC. Obviously, I know in kickboxing Pereira's winning, so the only guy in middleweight that has beaten Adesanya who Adesanya hasn't been able to beat back is Sean Strickland himself. He's a 2-time champion as well, because like I said, he was able to win the belt back back from Pereira. Couldn't get a defense though. And who knows, maybe he can become a champion again. Apparently UFC 305 is going to be Adesanya versus Dricus, and maybe we can see Adesanya become a 3-time champion. But middleweight definitely has to go to Israel Adesanya. 6 title defenses, still quite far from Anderson Silva, but what he did in his prime and his era, you've got to give it respect. Even though it might have not been the best competition, and it might have been that period in the middleweight division where it was quite stale, you've got to give Adesanya respect for that, and he is definitely the second greatest middleweight of all time. Welterweight, the second greatest welterweight of all time is Kamaru Usman. Yeah, Usman, he was insane. 15 wins in a row in the UFC, just behind Anderson Silva's record, and then Leon Edwards had to fuck it all up and get that head kick knockout, but he almost almost drew with Anderson Silva's streak of wins. He's got a win over the current champion and pound for pound number 3, Leon Edwards, who, by the way, is one of the only guys to beat him in the UFC. It's him and Khamzat Chimaev, so he's only lost twice at welterweight to a guy that he's beaten already. 5 title defenses as well. Usman's title reign might have been one of the most interesting title reigns to watch ever, because it was like we watched a fighter progress every single fight. At the start of his title reign, when he was fighting guys like Masvidal for the first time, and when he fought Tyron Woodley, he was just a heavy wrestler who didn't really have that good of, didn't have that great striking. And then as he progressed with his career, he started to use his hands a lot more. He broke Colby Covington's jaw. He slept Jorge Masvidal, and it felt like Usman was becoming more comfortable with his hand. And at one point, Usman genuinely looked unbeatable. Like the way that we view Islam Makhachev now, I once viewed Usman as that. I genuinely couldn't think of any welterweight to beat this guy during his title reign. He was that dominant. And he was almost on track to beating Leon Edwards as well. I know he didn't, and he got the head kick KO. But if that fight would have gone 1 extra minute and Leon wouldn't have landed the head kick, Usman would probably, I wouldn't say he would necessarily still be the champion, but he definitely would have had another defense. So welterweight has to go to Usman behind GSP. Yeah, you've got to give GSP that number 1 spot. He was, what that guy did in the welterweight division was insane. But number 2, I'm going to give it to Kamaru Usman. The lightweight division, this belongs to the Dagestanis. The current god of the lightweight division obviously has to go to Khabib Nurmagomedov, but I'm putting number 2 to Islam Makhachev, and it's quite close. 1 or 2 more defenses, and we might have to start talking about Islam Makhachev being the lightweight greatest of all time. There's other guys in the lightweight division who did really well as well, BJ Penn, but I'm going to have to put Islam Makhachev at number 2. 3 title defenses so far, 2 against Volkanovski, 1 against Poirier, but it's still counting. We don't know how many defenses he could potentially get. Obviously, he could beat Arman Sarukian. He might beat a couple more contenders, so there's not a cap on the amount of defenses, but he's got 3 so far. Only ever lost once in the UFC to Adriano Martins, which was obviously when he got slept, but apart from that, he's been able to beat every single opponent that's been put in front of him. And one thing I like about Makhachev is he has finished the literal best guys in the world. We talk about Adesanya having a bit of a title reign that was against maybe uninteresting and maybe the most uneventful opponents he could have possibly had. Islam Makhachev has literally faced the best. He beat and finished Charles Oliveira when Charles Oliveira was dominating the lightweight division. He head kick KO'd and took Volkanovski to a decision when Volkanovski was the pound for pound best, or at least one of the pound for pound best. And then he goes out there and beats Dustin Poirier as well. And he's also got some good wins. Bobby Green, Thiago Moises, Dan Hooker, Arman Sarukian when Sarukian debuted. His resume already is probably more impressive than Khabib's resume. And I think 1 or 2 more defenses and Makhachev can definitely become the greatest lightweight of all time. And he genuinely looks unbeatable. I can't look at one fighter in the UFC as of right now that I can confidently say beats Makhachev at 155. So I'm going to have to put Makhachev as the second greatest lightweight of all time. But to be honest, he's not even far from overtaking Khabib at that number 1 spot. And then featherweight, this is where it's probably the closest. Most people, 50-50. 50% of the people would say Aldo's the GOAT. 50% of the people would say Volkanovski's the GOAT. Personally, I've been a bit up and down in my career. Sometimes, not my career, what I mean about my career, but while I've been on YouTube, sometimes I'll say Volkanovski, sometimes I'll say Aldo. But my final decision is that Aldo is the GOAT and that Volkanovski's at that number 2 spot. Maybe there's a really slim chance that Volkanovski wins that belt back, but it's really slim. But what he's achieved already has been insane. 5 title defenses in the featherweight division. He only has 1 loss in the featherweight division, and obviously that's to Ilia Topuria, who's now the current champion, undefeated champion as well. He's dominated. This guy absolutely dominated the featherweight division. Look at what Max Holloway was doing to contenders, and then look at what Volkanovski did to Holloway in the trilogy. He absolutely destroyed him. Some other good wins as well in the featherweight division. That Yair Rodriguez fight was able to finish Rodriguez, put an absolute beating on the Korean Zombie. The absolute war he had with Brian Ortega. He's also been able to beat the current GOAT of the division, obviously out of his prime, in Jose Aldo. Volkanovski in the featherweight division, he was there to fuck shit up, and he absolutely did. This guy dominated the featherweight division. He was just so far ahead of everyone. Nobody could even come close to him. Like, Max Holloway was, fairly far ahead of every other featherweight, and Volkanovski's far ahead of Max Holloway. That's how good Volkanovski was in his prime, and he might have taken a loss to Topuria, but we've got to give him the credit. He is definitely, in my opinion, the second greatest of all time, and you know what? I'm not even mad if you put him at the number one greatest featherweight of all time. It's definitely between him and Aldo, and it's really, really close, but I've got to give it to Aldo, but Volkanovski, for me, has to go at second place. And then the bantamweight division, I'm going Aljamain Sterling. The current GOAT is Dominic Cruz, but I feel like Sean O'Malley's definitely on the way to becoming the greatest of all time if he keeps it up. But I'm going to put, as of right now, Aljamain Sterling. Some people might put TJ Dillashaw, some people might put Henry Cejudo, but I'm going to give it to Sterling. He had 3 title defenses, which is pretty credible. I know he had some some complications in those defenses. One of them, well, he won the belt off a knee. One of them was quite a boring fight. One of them was against an injured TJ Dillashaw, but he has had some good wins. Obviously, being able to beat Peter Yan twice. Peter Yan was seen as an absolute killer at the time, but he was able to beat him, especially in the rematch. That was that was not as controversial. He had a win over Henry Cejudo, TJ Dillashaw, choked out Corey Sandhagen, had a win over Pedro Munoz, so his bantamweight resume is actually really good. He had a 9-fight unbeaten streak from, well, towards the end of his title reign. But overall, Aljamain Sterling definitely has such a good bantamweight career, and I put him at number 2 behind behind Dominic Cruz. Some people were saying that if he was to go out there and beat Sean O'Malley, he would be that number 1 spot, and I wouldn't even be mad at that, but obviously he didn't beat Sean O'Malley. He got put to sleep, so I'll put Aljamain Sterling at that number 2 spot as the second greatest bantamweight of all time. He was nearly there, but obviously Sean O'Malley had to ruin the plan and KO Aljamain Sterling. And then the flyweight division, I'm going to say the current champion Pantoja is the second greatest flyweight of all time. I don't think anyone's coming close to Demetrius Johnson. From the way things seem, Demetrius Johnson is going to be the flyweight GOAT for the longest time, but I'm going to put Pantoja at that number 2 spot as of right now. He has 8 wins over current top 10 fighters. 8 wins. We talk about champions not being able to clear out the division. Nowadays, champions genuinely have like 1 or 2 wins, maybe 3 wins over current top 10 fighters, and then they'll try and move up to a different weight class or they'll lose their belt. Pantoja, and I know they've not all been in title fights, but this dude has 8 wins over current top 10 fighters. He was able to beat the best in Brandon Moreno 3 times. Roy Val's now ranked, I think, number 1. He's been able to beat him twice as well. Alex Perez, Manel Kape, Matt Schnell, this guy, Steve Erceg. He is beating a large majority of the flyweights in the top 10. He has only got 2 title defenses as of right now, but similar to Makhachev, it's still counting. We don't know how long this could go on for. He could go up to 4, 6 defenses. We don't know how long it's going to go on for, but he's got 2 defenses and counting. And he has literally cleared out the division. He is, out of every other champion right now, Pantoja has done the best job at beating the actual contenders in his division, and it's still going on. So I've got to give Pantoja that number 2 spot. Davison Figueiredo's had a pretty decent career as well, and he has been able to beat Pantoja, but I'm going to have to give it to Pantoja just because the amount of contenders that he is beating in the flyweight division. And that, in my opinion, is the second greatest of all time in every UFC weight class. Every single time someone talks about the GOAT, it always sparks some controversy. So I'm sure there's going to be people in the comments disagreeing, but let me know who you would put as the second greatest of all time in every weight class and your personal thoughts on this list, and thank you for watching.